Hey everyone, if you love digging into the actual mechanics of our government and uncovering the structural loopholes that shape our politics, you are absolutely in the right place. In today's Explainer, we're going to neutrally unpack a highly partisan and honestly, genuinely radical political maneuver that's been gaining a lot of traction among commentators on Blaze TV. They're calling it the Johnson option. Now, whether you lean left, right, or sit squarely in the center, understanding how these constitutional levers could theoretically be pulled is crucial for anyone who follows American politics. So we're going to look strictly at what the source material is proposing step by step.
All right, let's jump right in. Here's the roadmap for this procedural thought experiment. 1. The legislative roadblock. 2. The Article 1 loophole. 3. The Election Day trigger. 4. California versus Florida. And 5. The Supreme Court endgame.
Starting with Part 1, the legislative roadblock and why election reform in the Senate is currently stalled.
To really understand why such an outside-the-box constitutional workaround is even being proposed, we've got to look at the core frustration driving it: the stalled Save America Act. The commentators on Blaze TV are pointing out that, mathematically speaking, the traditional legislative route is just a total dead end right now. Republicans simply don't have the 50 Senate votes needed to pass this specific election integrity legislation, and the commentators specifically call out resistance from within their own party, naming senators like Susan Collins, Tom Tillis, Bill Cassidy, and Lisa Murkowski as the main roadblocks. So they describe their current situation in Congress not as a true working majority, but really more of a quasi-majority. Because they can't rely on the Senate to pass federal election laws, they feel totally paralyzed by the standard legislative process.
And adding serious fuel to this fire? A ticking clock. The speaker in our source material emphasizes that there are only about 4 months left to secure what they view as absolutely necessary election integrity measures before the opportunity is gone completely. Think about how a timeline like that changes the math. They aren't just framing this as a practical necessity. They see it as a dire moral imperative for the survival of the republic. It's this exact combination, a completely blocked Senate and a rapidly ticking clock, that's serving as the catalyst for this radical new strategy.
Which brings us to Part 2, the Article 1 loophole, and bypassing the Senate entirely.
So if this Senate is a brick wall, how do you actually force changes to election laws? Well, the proposed workaround relies entirely on Article 1, Section 5 of the U.S. Constitution. This clause states pretty plainly that each house shall be the judge of the elections, returns, and qualifications of its own members. The Blaze TV commentators are highlighting a massive implication of this text. Basically, they argue this power is largely unreviewable by the judicial branch, meaning the courts generally cannot force the House of Representatives to seat a member if the House decides that member's election was invalid. It is an absolute internal power held solely by the House majority.
So here's the real kicker: how they actually want to weaponize this clause. The commentators frame Article 1, Section 5 as a direct tool for the House to indirectly audit and basically force changes to state election laws. The logic goes like this: if the federal Congress can't pass a law requiring something like voter ID in California, the House majority can just impose its will by refusing to accept the results of elections held without those standards. Think about that for a second. They are proposing using the seating of local representatives as direct leverage over entire state governments.
Moving to Part 3, the Election Day trigger, and executing the Johnson option.
Okay, so what does this actually look like in practice? The commentators laid out a very precise procedural roadmap aimed squarely at current Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. Step 1, when the new Congress convenes, Speaker Johnson and the House majority would categorically refuse to seat any representative from the California delegation who wasn't officially leading their race on the night of Election Day. Step 2, those unseated members aren't just sent packing, instead they're referred to an individualized House committee hearing. And Step 3, the burden of proof totally shifts. The representative has to show up and prove to the committee that their late-counted victory was legitimate. If they can't satisfy the House majority, they don't get seated and California is forced to hold a special election.
Just to give you a sense of the sheer intensity behind this proposal, listen to how the source material describes this potential move by Speaker Johnson. Quote, "This would be the most legacy-establishing, based, actually saving America move that we will have, I think, ever seen from a Speaker of the House." I'm bringing up this quote just to impartially show the absolute gravity and enthusiasm these commentators attach to this idea. They do not see this as some minor procedural trick. To them, it's a historic, heroic intervention.
That takes us to Part 4, California versus Florida, a tale of two election systems.
To really grasp why they are targeting California specifically, you have to look at the stark contrast the speaker draws between two very different state election systems. On one hand, you have Florida. They point out that Florida delivers its results within 2 hours of the polls closing, requires strict voter ID, and operates with a level of transparency that, in their view, leaves no room for the opposing party to even claim cheating. But then, on the other hand, you have California. The commentators express deep frustration with California's system, which often takes weeks to count late-arriving mail-in ballots. They don't just see California as doing things differently, they explicitly frame the state as an abnormal outlier compared to the rest of the Western world.
And to put this into perspective, the speaker brings up a really staggering number, 27 million. That is how many votes the country of Peru managed to count to over 90% completion in just 12 hours following an election. They contrast this massive, rapid count with California, expressing genuine embarrassment that a U.S. state takes weeks to count a fraction of that amount. This math is really the core of their argument. It's used to validate their anger and justify why, in their eyes, California's system is illegitimate enough to actually warrant deploying the Johnson option.
And finally, Part 5, the Supreme Court endgame, and forcing a constitutional standoff. Because ultimately, refusing to seat members isn't just about punishing California, it's a means to an end. The end goal here is a high-stakes institutional game of chicken played out in 3 phases. First, by refusing to seat these members, the House forces an unprecedented direct negotiation with the California state government. They're essentially saying, we won't seat your reps until you fix your system. Second, they use that leverage to demand tangible, immediate changes to the state's election processes. And third, they absolutely know this is going to cause massive legal friction. In fact, that's the point. It's intentionally designed to trigger an intervention by the United States Supreme Court. The commentators aren't shying away from a legal battle at all. They are actively inviting it. Their stated hope is that the Supreme Court will be forced to step in to resolve this standoff, and in doing so, they want the court to issue a definitive ruling that Election Day literally means Election Day. They're hoping the highest court will mandate a strict interpretation of the voting timeline, which would effectively outlaw the extended counting of late mail-in ballots nationwide. And they firmly believe the current conservative majority on the court would be open to that exact argument.
So, what does this all mean? We are left with a massive question that strikes right at the heart of American constitutional law. Would weaponizing Article 1, Section 5 like this actually save the Republic by forcing tighter election security, like the source material passionately argues? Or would having the federal legislature unilaterally reject states' certified democratic elections trigger an unprecedented and potentially dangerous constitutional crisis? It's a wild procedural thought experiment with incredibly high stakes. Definitely keep the ramifications of this in mind the next time you hear debates about congressional power versus state rights. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning how the system works.